Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the GeoDiv's fourth online lecture for the year. Today's topic is ground improvement. Can plastic bottle waste be used as a potential reinforcement for granular columns? Today's lecture will be presented by Dr. Laxmee Sobhee-Beetul from the University of Cape Town. Before we start the lecture, a few formalities. All the previous lectures, that is Gavin Burns' lecture on piling fundamentals and Dr. Nico's site investigation lectures, both part 1 and part 2, as well as the ISS MGE Design Challenge Survey, are available to view on the Geotechnical Division's webpage under the Events section. The lectures are also available on the GeoDiv's YouTube channel. I have posted both links in the announcement section of this lecture. Okay, in order to verify attendance for CPD points, I would kindly ask you to submit your name, surname, and email address into the Q&A session on this live event. Your details will not be published and it will only be used to verify attendance for this event. So if you could please post your details in the Q&A session now. Just like previous online lectures, we will hold the Q&A session for the end of the presentation. We have set aside 90 minutes for today's online lecture, but we will see how time goes. Okay, so as I said, today's lecture will be presented by Dr. Laxmee. And a brief introduction to Dr. Laxmee. Dr. Laxmee Sobhee-Beetul is a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. She holds her BSc, MSc, and PhD in civil engineering from the University of Cape Town, and she joined the university as a lecturer after completing her PhD in 2019. She has written several conference and journal papers on the use of plastic waste in the construction industry and in granular columns. Her research areas and interests include ground improvement, solid waste management, and environmental sustainability in construction. She is a member of SAICE, GIGSA, IGS, and the ISS MGE. She is also the current Cape Town representative for the SAICE Geotechnical Division. With that, Dr. Laxmee, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome for this evening's lecture. So today I will be sharing with you a journey which I've spent on my PhD research for a good few years, researching a topic that I'm very passionate about, plastic waste, and how can plastic waste be used in the construction industry. So today we will look at the research which was done and completed in 2019, and we'll see how the whole research started and ended. Of course, not to say it's ended, it's still progressing, but at least a part of what I'm presenting to you today has reached completion. So the presentation outline, I will introduce the topic, give you some inspiration behind the study, provide a background, give some research motivation and how the study contributes to knowledge. I will explain to you what's the proposed technology, what experimental approach was undertaken, and the findings which were obtained from the research. And I will end up with a conclusion. I would just like to highlight at this stage that the PhD research, as you're all aware, is an intense amount of work, and is unfortunate that we cannot present the whole work as is within 90 minutes. So I've tried to really narrow down and take the most key components and interesting components, which probably will be appealing to you, to present to you today. Before I head off to the topic, because it's in the area of ground improvement, I just want to introduce what ground improvement is, in case we have some of the members of the audience who are not aware of the technique. So it's basically the act of altering and improving soil properties for construction purposes. Why do we need ground improvement? Well, it's a rather obvious thing that will say that there's a high land demand, and that's not just to say in South Africa, it's pretty much everywhere in the world. And Previously, sites which were considered unfeasible both economically and technically, we are now faced with the challenges of trying to make use of the sites, and therefore we need to look into ways of improving the ground properties of the sites. And thus, ground improvement is really important. In this study, I specifically looked at one type of ground improvement, and that technique is called granular columns. So as I've just said before, we were faced with challenges of how to construct something that we want on a particular site with poor ground properties, but we were probably unable at those times to find a solution around that. So let's just look at a very brief scenario. If we have a project, we would like a construction to happen on a low strength soil such as a silty clay or a clay, what are our options? The first option would probably be to abandon the project, but that's not a very realistic option. So if we do proceed with the project, what are the approaches that we need to take? The engineering approaches will most likely be either to replace the in-situ soil or to opt for ground improvement. Now, replacing in-situ soil is not that practical from both an environmental and an economical point of view. It can be a very lengthy process, or if you've got grounds with very deep layers of clay, it's not very practical to replace the in-situ soil. So ground improvement then becomes very handy. Let me share with you the inspiration behind this study. So as we are all very aware of the issues around plastic waste around the globe, these are pictures which I've picked off the internet randomly to share with you. They are all in South Africa. The first one being in Cape Town, we can see Table Mountain in the background, but that's the beautiful beach, and look what's sitting there. And if you look at the other one, I think that one is in Durban, if I'm not mistaken. And we see a pretty much similar scenario with, I mean, besides the wooden logs, that's not harmful to the environment, I would say, but the plastic, that's a very big question there. What is it going to do to marine life and also aesthetically? So who are the affected parties when we have issues like that? There's definitely marine life and the ecological system. Because aesthetically it's not pleasant, it affects the tourist industry. Also, when it affects marine life, there's also the risk of food poisoning due to contamination of seafood. And the other issue is bringing landfills to capacity much faster, because now we need to find a way of getting rid of these plastics, something that the civil engineers connect very well with. So what is really being done? I mean, to say, for those who are involved and who are aware, a lot is being done in the area from different professionals involved. A lot is being done. How can we reduce? How can we reuse? How can we recycle? This is an example of a picture of how waste PET bottles have been used to produce a plastic bottle garden. Campaigns are regularly being done to sensibilize citizens, and that includes cleaning up of different spaces, public spaces. Recycling, a very popular one now. New products are coming on the market, things that sometimes you do not even realize. The jackets that we're wearing, shoes, pencil cases, they're all coming from those recycled plastics. But now the big question is, this is an inspiration. How does that fit into civil engineering? How is it going to contribute to the industry? So the study basically started 9 years ago in 2010. It's evolved over 9 years. We've got a stage 1, a stage 2, and a stage 3. So in stage 1 of the study, shopping plastic bags were actually used to reinforce. And those were post-consumer bags. They were used to reinforce sand and check for the improvement in the shear strength. For those who have been following my research, probably will know this one because this was the first presentation I had. And it kind of attracted a lot of attention of how can we use plastic bags. So that was the first stage of the study. And a notable improvement was obtained in terms of the shear strength of the sand. In stage 2, I carried on being, so let me just give you a little bit of a background for myself. I'm somebody who's a civil engineer, but who is also very passionate about the environment. I like to use civil engineering in a way that will be less harmful to the environment. I cannot say not harmful, but as much as we can we have construction done in a sustainable way, environmentally sustainable way? So of course, my research is very much inclined into ways that is more environmentally sustainable. So if you look at the stage 2 of the study, this is now granular columns. You will see on the left side, it's sand columns installed in the ground, and the second picture are stone columns. So this was a study that was done in the laboratory at the University of Cape Town, where I tried to replicate a scenario of a row of columns. So you will see further down on the slide. And while testing, the results which I obtained definitely confirmed that granular columns are quite benefiting in trying to improve the load that a weak ground can take, but also at the same time reduce the settlement. The conclusion from that study was that stone columns were much better performing than sand columns, especially when it comes to larger columns. But for the smaller ones, sand columns were then a better options. And that was simply because when it's very small, there's a very small amount of stone, and the stone tended to intrude into the softer ground surrounding it, and thus losing the strength of the column. And in stage 3 of the study, it was basically to combine both these stages. So then we obtain a scenario where we are using plastic to reinforce the granular columns. But now the question is, what type of plastic to use? So before we get to that, let me first explain a little bit what granular columns are for those who are not aware of it. It's also very popular. I'm using the term granular columns because it kind of covers different materials which is now used to make these columns. But a lot of us, when I interact with the professionals from the industry, they know the technique by stone columns. So if you're thinking and you're wondering, is granular column is the same thing as stone column? Yes, it is. It's just that when we see granular column, it can also be other type of material, for example, sand or rock dust and all of that. So what are the benefits of these columns? They improve the bearing capacity, they reduce settlement, mitigate liquefaction, and enhance drainage in soils of poor ground properties. They are very popular for cost effectiveness, versatility, and environmental friendliness, and also very popular overseas, I must say. There are different methods of installing them. By now, there's different methods on the market around the globe. But the common thing that we will observe is it's either installed using a ramming approach or a vibration approach. In this research, we've gone through with the ramming approach. The granular columns, they're actually not a new technology or a recent technology. They've actually been around for many, many years. So if you look at the picture of the Taj Mahal here, there's a document where it explains how the Taj Mahal is actually founded. And it's a very heavy structure. I mean, for those who know, it's made of marble. It's a very heavy structure that's supported on stone columns. There's also the French military engineers who used the foundation, which is improved with stone columns to support heavy foundations of ironworks. And that was in the year 1830. So you can see it's really an old technique, which kind of was left behind a little bit, and then over time it picked up again and resurfaced as what we all know quite a bit is vibro replacement and all of that. So as I've said earlier, the technique is quite popular overseas, and Barksdale and Barkus reported in 1983 on how popular the technique was at that time, definitely in US, Canada, or Europe. Typical applications would be in embankment support for highways, interchanges, and bridge. Structures, I would say here, it's not for very tall structures. So it would be for a few stories, and also very popular in sewage treatment plants, warehouses, oil tanks, shipbuilding facility, and parking garage. railroad and wharf structure. These are some typical examples where they can be used. Also ideal to be used in soft silts and clays, and as I've said earlier, it's used for increasing bearing capacity, reduce settlement, mitigate liquefaction, and very often for drainage as well. But now the question that I asked myself at that stage when I started the study was, if the technique is so popular in other countries, why is the use so minimal in South Africa? I could not find a reason for that, and I decided to investigate a bit more. And as I spoke to different professionals from the industry, I realized that it's probably a technique that's not applicable, that cannot be applied everywhere in South Africa. It's really dependent on the geology. However, having said that, there's still a lot of potential for the technique. And the good part of it, as I said earlier, is it's cost effective and it's quite versatile as well. So from a research done by the AGIS in 2011, they reported that about 50% of South Africa's soil coverage constitutes of poor geotechnical properties. So if you have a situation like that, and there's also a high land demand due to the rapid development, there's definitely need to look into options of how to cater for these lands and make them usable. So therefore, there's a need for ground improvement. So if I go back a little bit regarding granular columns, so I completed the stage 2 of the study, which was the initial stage of studying granular column in 2012. And then there was somebody else who took some further research in terms of numerical modeling in 2014. And from the results which were obtained in between those times, it definitely showed that there's great potential for exploring and researching more about the technique. And therefore, in 2015, I started researching on the granular column method. So I picked a few there's different ground improvement approaches. There's many, the list is so long, but I pick up a few that's very common, very, very popular and very common. That includes dynamic compaction, vibrostone column, the limestone column, preloading, vertical drains, indirect ground freezing, direct ground freezing, grouting, and geosynthetics. The idea was to really get techniques that are quite popular and to see how they have the different benefits of the different characteristics that I've mentioned above on the table here: densification, drainage, liquefaction, settlement control, environmental, economical, fast process, and reduced permeability. So if you actually look at that and look at limestone column, and you will see there's a lot of benefits that the limestone column can cover. Not forgetting that they cannot be applied in every single project. So if you have a very heavy structure, high-rise building, that's not a technique to be used for that kind of foundation. So recall what I've said earlier. The plan is therefore in stage 3 of the study to combine the granular column with the plastic waste to form reinforced granular column. But now you're probably asking me, I've very briefly mentioned the problems around plastic, but what exactly plastic waste? Is there really such an importance for that? Is it really such a big problem having plastic waste around as much as we're hearing all the advertising and campaigning and everything that's in the talks and the journal papers that's going on around, and really educating us about the importance of reducing our plastic waste? There's a Waste Act, for those of you who are aware, and it really emphasizes on the reduction, reuse, recycling, and recovery of waste. CSIR in 2011 highlighted the importance, the difficulties around landfills nearing their end life, and also said that there are difficulties in finding suitable sites for landfills in South Africa. So all of that is becoming a problem. And therefore, they proposed, CSIR proposed, that it would probably be a good idea to divert some recyclables from the landfill. So in 2014, 315,000 approximately tons of plastics were diverted from landfill. And out of the plastics which were recycled locally, 90.2% were mechanically recycled in the country, while the remaining were exported. So if you look at the figure on the right here, it's the waste hierarchy. And as you go up, this is what we mostly desire. And the bottom part, disposal, is our last option. So if one can prevent the use of plastic, that's the ideal. But the second would be prepare for reuse. And if you cannot reuse, then at least you're able to recycle it. Otherwise, look for other methods of recovery. And the last option would be to dispose of, and that is in your landfill. So Plastic SA, which is the plastic regulating body in South Africa, they've set a target for zero plastics to landfill by 2030. And I must say they're doing very well at the moment. And they identified 7 key areas which were in compatibility with the government's National Development Plan. And where does my research fit into all of this is, and number 2, where they're encouraging more research and development into technologies and markets. In terms of the legislation around waste, now, if we look at the Waste Act, it talks about the minimizing of the consumption of natural resources, reducing, reusing, recycling, and recovering of waste, and securing ecologically sustainable development while promoting economic and social development. So if we look at that and we look at the study that I've proposed, the technology that I've proposed, it will help in minimizing the consumption of natural resources. How? The aim is to reduce, because in my granular column, I'm proposing to use sand as a material. So we'll go into more details later, just to give you a little bit of a background so you know where we're sitting in terms of the objectives of the Waste Act. So when we are using less sand to make the column and we are substituting that with the plastic waste, which is a problem in terms of our landfill space, so that automatically minimizes the natural resource, which is the sand that we're using. At the same time, we are also reusing our waste. And the third is to secure ecologically sustainable development. Automatically, a ground which is improved with granular columns, which is already fairly ecologically sustainable, as opposed to using, for instance, maybe a pile, which is made from cement. From an environmental point of view, the cement is not that great of a material, although we have to use it under certain circumstances. So if you look at the objectives of the Waste Act, then it makes sense why it's important to look at other technologies as well. So in this technology, polyethylene terephthalate, that is your PET, is the bottle, the type of bottle that was chosen, and that's typically your juice bottle, water bottle, or the soap bottles. I've put some examples here. That's typically the type of bottles that we're looking at. And why specifically did I choose PET for the study? There's a high usage of this type of plastic in the country, and therefore there's high abundance. They're also very strong compared to plastic bags. So now why am I comparing this to plastic bags is because remember in the first stage of the study, plastic bags were used to reinforce the sand to investigate how much improvement is obtained in the shear strength. So based on the outcome from there, I kind of realized that it's not providing enough strength that I would want, especially in a granular column where there needs to be some kind of compaction of the material during installation. So PET is quite a strong material, and therefore I decided to go with this one. Also, the target of 70% recycling rate by 2022, which is an information that was obtained from Petco. They control the whole recycling of PET in the country. And in 2017, the recycling rate of PET was at 65%, which is very high, which is actually a very good rate of recycling if compared to other countries across the world. Up to date, we've managed to save 96,771 tons of carbon and 400,000 meter cube of landfill space saved from PET recycling. This information is slightly outdated, so I haven't checked the recent report. It should be much, much higher by now. So PET is denoted by your triangle with the number 1, which probably most of us know. Let us now look at the recycling process of PET. So what happens to the life cycle of a PET bottle? It's manufactured, the consumer uses it and then discard. It's collected, sent to a plant where it's segregated, washed, grinded, and then you obtain the flakes. After the flakes, it's washed, dried, and pelletized, and the pellets are now warmed up, heated to get fibers, and these fibers are then used to manufacture different things, your fabric, jackets, and very popular amongst us geotechnical engineers is the geotextiles. So why do I have these encircled figures? That's because these are the materials which I've decided to use for reinforcing my granular columns. I've looked at the recycling process, the cycle, what materials can I pick along. So the aim was to try and see how can I use the material in as closer to their waste form as I can and see how they perform. Because as we go along, there's obviously the use of water, the use of more electricity and therefore energy, and how environmentally friendly would it be is the question. Having said that, we still need to consider the fact that it might not provide as enough improvement as expected, and therefore different other materials were also considered along the cycle. These are just some PET recycling facts and figures for South Africa. 1 ton of PET is equivalent to 30,000 PET bottles. And my favorite one is you need 25 recycled PET bottles to produce a fleece jacket for an adult. So if you're wearing a fleece jacket at the moment, just think about you're probably wearing 25 recycled PET bottles on you. So the point of now using the PET waste in the different forms that I've just mentioned now, the flakes, the fibers, and the fabric, which in this study was used in the form of the geotextile. The point is to actually reinforce the granular column internally so that it's more stiff and it's also much higher shear strength. So let me give you a little bit of a background of soil reinforcement theory. It's an ancient principle which exists in nature. If we look at trees and plants, the roots, the way they act in the soil is already soil reinforcement. And we did not create all of that. That's there in nature. But in 1960, Henry Vidal invented reinforced earth. And he explained that it's basically the formation of a homogeneous composite mass of soil and inclusions. And the composite mass, it has higher resistance and lower deformability than unreinforced soil. Schlosser and Delage basic mechanism explained through the friction generation between soil and reinforcement. That's how they explained it. So Vidal provided a figure and then he explained how the particles tied together with the reinforcement, thus forming a form of a pseudo cohesion, where that's how it becomes the composite, where it's looked at as one mass. Now, what are the different factors that govern the performance of reinforced soil? So the reinforcement itself, which is obvious, the size, the form, the strength, the stiffness. There's also the soil. If we are saying that the composite mass when we're doing soil reinforcement includes the soil and the reinforcement, it is obvious that the performance of the reinforced soil will be dependent on these factors, characteristics of the reinforcement and characteristics of the soil. So for the soil, it will be the particle size, the mineral content, index properties out of many others. The soil state, how dense is the material, the overburden, state of stress, degree of saturation. And construction, the structure, geometry, degree of compaction, construction method, and durability. What are the benefits of soil reinforcement? They are very important to improve structural capability through better shear resistance. There's also a minimal land acquisition as a result of the steepness of the walls. Soil reinforcement helps to lower time for construction. They also enhance soil properties, resulting in the soil to be used as a structural component, depending on the type of reinforcement used, obviously. So I've included a few previous studies here, which you will see how different researchers have progressed over the years using different types of plastic waste material. So I have really included studies that have looked into plastic waste and none other forms of reinforcement for the study. So you will see HDP is quite a popular one. PET is also quite popular, but they've been used in a context where they're testing, they're doing CBR test, direct shear test, and basically the aim is to just replace the in situ soil, at least to a certain extent. Whereas in this study, we are looking more at improving granular columns. So the advantage with that, as opposed to replacing the in situ soil with a reinforced soil, would be that it's more practical in terms of removing all your in situ material and then transporting that somewhere else. It can be quite inconvenient. Also not great for the environment, can be also very costly, and can also be a lengthy process. So by installing the granular columns, you basically just install your columns, weave the reinforcement within there without having to bother about what's going on and where you're going to dump the in situ material. So the theoretical behavior and design procedures have been explained by many. There's Yokes and Withers, Barksdale and Bacchus, Freeby, and many others. Greenwood has also spoken quite a bit about granular column, and he mentioned that the degree of improvement that is achieved when you have a ground improved granular column is dependent on the passive pressure that the column is deriving from the surrounding soil. A very important concept when dealing with granular column is the unit cell concept, the extent of improvement from a single stone column. Balam et al. In 1978, they mentioned that the performance of any single column in a group of columns is equal to that of another, which is why the unit cell concept makes sense. So when you are testing and you're analyzing, you do not have to look at the whole group of columns, because you know that every single column is going to approximately perform the same way. And this concept has been adopted by many researchers so far. Han in 2015 assumed that claimed that many researchers assume that one dimension itself, and hence no lateral deformation of the column. So basically on the side, the movement is restricted and only vertical movement is allowed. Installation is typically done in those very two common ways. It's either triangular or square patterns, but there's also a few other methods not too common. The spacing to diameter ratio for triangular grids are usually 2.5 to 4. And the spacing is also affected by bearing capacity and consolidation time of drainage. The spacing that you use will affect these two. What are the factors affecting soil column behavior? So there's the column dimensions, evidently undrained shear strength of the soil, in situ lateral stress of the soil, radial stress strain characteristics of the soil, stress strain characteristics, and friction angle of the column material. So now, why is the undrained shear strength of the soil so important? Why is the in situ lateral stress of the soil so important? So what is a granular column, basically? If I can take you back to this, picture, you're creating an opening in the ground, and then you're filling that opening and compacting the material, whichever way, vibration or ramming, to form a column, which is not bound by cement or anything. So all the material are loose in a way, but compacted. So the way these can be kept as one piece is through the passive resistance that they are getting from the surrounding materials. It's the confining stresses from the surrounding in situ material. That's why the undrained shear strength of the soil and the in situ lateral stress of the soil dictates the behavior. Here's a compilation again of previous studies of what different researchers have done and in terms of what column reinforcement they've done. It's not a completely new technology to internally reinforce, granular columns, but the most common one that you will see being researched around is external reinforcement, which is typically made from geotextile or geogrid. And the geogrid, when they do that, they actually use those big stones and they encase the column with the geogrid. So in this case, it's not going to be an external reinforcing, but it's more like an internal reinforcing. So the major hypothesis for the research was when granular columns are internally reinforced with PET flakes, fibers, or geotextiles, the load-bearing strength and settlement reduction are enhanced. The main objectives of the investigation was to compare, to draw a comparison of the load carrying capacity of the columns when reinforced with the different types of PET reinforcement, and also to look at the deformation characteristics of each tested column. The experimental approach is that's like a typical test setup where on the left-hand side, there's a different type of inclusion, internal inclusion of the reinforcement material as opposed to the right-hand side. So there are two types of scenarios we looked at when including the reinforcement material. One was random mixing of the reinforcement, and the other was layering, which is on the right side, layering of the reinforcement material. So more details on that can actually be accessed on in my dissertation. It is available online. I've provided a link for you if you are interested to download it towards the end of my presentation. What were the constant in this study? The diameter of the tank was set at 300 millimeter. There were steel tanks, and they were set at a diameter of 300 millimeters. The column were 100 millimeter in diameter and 400 millimeter in length. The moisture content of the base soil was not a constant. Sorry, that was varied. Two different types of moisture. It was the optimum moisture content and the liquid limit. So there were two different ground conditions were looked at, two extremes, one fairly dry and the other one quite wet. The type of sand, the type of silt was a constant, and the type of sand was also a constant. All locally sourced. The variables were the type of reinforcement. So the flakes, as I mentioned in the recycling cycle, the recycling process earlier, the flakes were was one type of reinforcement, and there were the fibers, and then the geotextiles, which were manufactured from these fibers, were also used. Now, in terms of the geotextile, there are two different types of geotextiles that are used. The one was manufactured from the waste fibers from the PET bottles, and the other type of geotextile was actually manufactured from virgin PET. So the point was to draw a comparison to see how does the waste, the geotextile manufactured from waste, the performance, how does it compare to the one that's manufactured from virgin PET? The arrangement of the reinforcement, as I've said earlier, that was a variable. Was it random mixing or was it layering within the column? The concentration of the flakes, there were three different types of concentration. Concentration of fibers, three different types as well, and the mass of the geotextile, be it from the waste PET or the virgin PET. For each one of them, there were three different types that were looked at. These are the soils that were used at optimum moisture content, OMC. As you can see, that's the in situ silt that was used, the silt that was used to replicate the in situ condition within the testing tank. And LL is the liquid limit. So that's the texture that was obtained for a silt that was mixed at liquid limit. And the granular material was the sand that was used to form the column. The materials in terms of the reinforcements, at the top you can see the geotextile. They were cut into discs of 99 millimeters with different perforations of 7 millimeters. The perforations were included to allow for proper gripping around the material, and also if there's any excess water pressure, it would allow for dissipation. The flakes, as you can see further down, these are the flakes, and the sizes varied between 2.36 and 9.5 millimeters. And the fibers, as you see, it looked very similar to a cotton wool, but it just seemed much stronger. That's a microscopic view of the fibers, and the average diameter was 24.6 micrometers. So these are two sample preparation of the material which was being prepared for a test. On the left hand side is a silt bed prepared at optimum moisture content, while on the right it's a silt bed prepared at liquid limit. Here is a description of how exactly the column is installed. So once as I've shown here, once this bed is prepared, then it's covered with a top, as you can see, that the plate, the circular plate at the top, it's covered with that. And then there's the cylinder, a hollow cylinder is pushed through for that collar. It's pushed all the way down. So if you look in figure B, you will see the brown inside within the hollow cylinder. That's the soil that needs to be augered out. So a manual auger was used, and the soil was cut out, and the cylinder inside was nice, clean, and dry. The column material was then poured in, and the first step was to pour the material and then retract by 35 millimeters. So the point was to get different layers, to form different layers within the column of 50 millimeter height. So the initial one was 35 millimeter because it allows for the hollow cylinder to still be stuck in that first layer. And the reason that was very important is because it prevents smearing of the soft silt, and also the intrusion of the material within the column. So the little bit that was left within the 35 millimeter sand, that allowed for that. So the process was repeated for each layer. There was a total of 8 layers, and it was a repeated process of pouring the sand, compacting it, and then retracting first, and then compacting, and then pouring another layer, then retracting the cylinder, and then compacting again. Why is it important to retract before you compact? Is because once you retract and then you compact, it allows the column to connect perfectly with the soil around without leaving any space. If you retract after that, it will include some kind of settlement around the material and also disturb the degree of compaction that was achieved. And then in figure E, that's a test sample prepared with the sand column inside. That's a pure sand column, no reinforcement in. So for a random mixed sample, so the sand is mixed as in figure A. It's randomly mixed with the flakes. The same thing happens for when we do for a fiber that's randomly mixed within the sand. And then it's poured into layers, as I explained in the previous slide. When I'm doing a layer, then the layer is poured. Once I've put my sand, then I compact the sand and I pour a layer I place a layer of my reinforcement on top of that to cover it. So all these values were obtained from, derived from literature, trials, and all of that. And then you will see I've got a table later where it actually mentions how much of the material has been used in the different tests. that's a typical test setup where the cylindrical tank has been placed on the machine. It's a compression machine, and it's connected for data to be recorded electronically. And in B, you can actually see the system being loaded. And the second part that's very interesting of the study is to actually physically model each column that was tested. So the aim of that was to understand what is happening to a granular column when it's loaded in compression. What is happening to the deformation inside? How is it deforming? So the way to do that was to basically remove the compression load after the test and to very carefully take out the loading plate, as you can see in B, then use a vacuum, not at a high speed, quite carefully and gently without allowing it to suck on the side of the surface and to suck all the sand out. And then in C, you will see that was a setup where a geotextile was used as different layers. So that's pulled out, and then a spatula and a brush is used to very smoothly clean the surface. And the process has to be done quite quickly, doing one where the test is at liquid limit. And that's because the material at liquid limit is quite soft. And the moment you've taken the column out, it means that it starts slightly, gradually pulling back into and collapsing into the hole. So the process has to be quite quick. Once it's all clean, as shown in E, then in F, plaster of Paris, a paste of that is prepared and poured into, that was mixed with sand and poured into and allowed to set overnight. The next morning, it's taken out and you get the model. So this column that we've now taken out is not the column that was in place, remember? This is we've actually modeled the deformation of the column which was in place before. Remember, we've taken the column already. So we've just modeled the deformation. Now, it's very interesting to see when we've done something like that, how your column is actually deforming in the ground. And the process has been repeated for a total of 42 experiments were conducted for this research. So all the processes that I've described now have been repeated for all the 42 experiments, including also some repeatability. There was also a quality control and repeatability of results, which was done as part of the research to make sure that it's high quality findings that we're getting. So initially, I refined the testing procedure. Several trials were done to make sure that we're eliminating all possible source, or at least the most possible source of errors, and also to ensure the same procedure is precisely repeated for each test, both when doing the loading test and for physically modeling the deformations. Repeatability tests were also undertaken to check for repeatability relative standard deviation and to make sure that they were less than 5%. For the study, it was agreed that 5% was a reasonable, acceptable range. The testing procedure was highly repeatable based on the outcome that was found. This is just a graph showing some of the repeatability of the results. I won't spend too much time there. I'm checking the time now. But basically, you can see how the graphs are. If I just take, for instance, the M2S RP 0.15%. So that's 1, 2, and 3. So that means this whole row here, the whole top row, is for the same type of experiment, but it has been repeated 3 times. So if we look at that, that one, which is going, look at the curve there, you will see almost all 3 results are approximately the same. They're almost all going on the same curve, with very, very slight differences. The same thing has been done for deformation of the results. It's been plotted and observed to make sure that the column is not deforming. In this test, it's deforming that way, and then if I do the same test again another time, it's deforming in a different way. So you can actually see they deform pretty much the same way. Now, in this research, if you actually look at the dissertation, as I've said, I provided a link at the end. If you look at the dissertation, you will see that there are endless number of graphs and charts and the deformation figures in the study. It's not possible for me to present all of that in here, or if I try to squeeze all of them in, you will probably not be able to see any one of them and understand really what it means. So I've decided to leave that one out, but taken one of them, which looks like is quite an interesting figure to look at. So if you look at this one, the M2 is basically a pure ground. M2 is the liquid limit one. So that's the wetter silt that we're trying to improve. So this one is without any column inside. It's just a pure silt that has been tested under compression. And this is the vertical applied stress that we're getting. And all tests were conducted up to a maximum settlement of 50 millimeter, and that was based on Eurocode 7, which suggests 50 millimeters settlement for normal structures. If we look at the green line, M2S, that means it's a test of the silt at liquid limit with a sand column inside, but the sand column is not reinforced. So if we look at that, we see there is improvement when we include a column in that kind of test setup. There's definitely improvement in terms of the load carrying capacity of the improved ground. Now, what's very interesting to note is if I improve internally these sand columns by reinforcing them with the waste, in this case, I use randomly mixed fibers on this chart. So if you look at that, you will see as you increase the concentration of the fibers, look how much improvement you can achieve in the load carrying capacity of the column. And this is quite drastic. If you look at a normal sand column, which was about, I would say probably about 40, 45, but in another test where the column has been reinforced with a concentration of 0.1% per mass per unit weight of the fiber, the vertical applied stress is now reached slightly beyond 100 kPa. That's more than double what it can take. So there's definitely interesting results out of the study. I mean, a lot of tests were done, and I will have to say that not all of them has given promising result. Some of them you will see actually worsen the situation, especially when flakes were used. But a lot of them definitely showed good improvement. Another one here is when the geotextile, which was manufactured from waste PET, was used. So you will see, even in this one, as the mass per unit area of the geotextile changed, the 200 here is basically showing 200 gram per meter square, 400 gram per meter square, and 600 gram per meter square for that, the characteristic of the geotextile. So as that value increased, you will see that there was also an improvement in the vertical applied stress. So I've now compiled a table. As I've said earlier, I haven't given all the figures because it would just be too much of information overload, and I do not want you to leave from here losing interest of the study, but rather to actually capture how interesting the study can be. And it's really worthwhile to look into more research relating to that. So I've basically provided a table where it's summarizing the different maximum vertical applied stress. When I say maximum vertical applied stress, it means that at the end of the test, what was the vertical applied stress that was recorded? And that would correspond to a settlement of 50 millimeters. So this one was all for random mixing. I believe the video will be up later at some point, and then you can probably just sit and have a look at that. Or even better, have a look at the link of the dissertation. It explains everything so well that if you're lost now, you will not be lost then. It's really interesting to see how the different materials operate. And these ones are for layering. I want to show you guys here is M1, as I said, is just a pure pure silt bed. M1S is one with a sand column. So let's look at the liquid limit, because the results are a bit more obvious in that one. If you look at a ground that's at liquid limit. So if you look at the M2, which is the test which is done on a silt bed that has been prepared with a soil at liquid limit. So that one, the vertical applied stress was 30 kPa. So if I put a normal sand column in, then it changed to 52 kPa. When I reinforced the sand column with 0.5% concentration of randomly placed plastic flakes, it changed to 72 kPa. And that's pretty much how each one of them goes. So if I look at in terms of the fiber, the kPa has even reached 104. Remember, I showed you on that figure. So look how much of changes there has been from a ground that was only allowed to support 30 kPa. It's now able to support 104 kPa per column, obviously. And it's quite similar analogies. Some of them you will actually see there has been a drop in the vertical applied stress. So now in terms of the that's for the load settlement characteristics. In terms of the deformation characteristics, so what I basically did is I got a series of these columns. So like I said, I had 42 experiments done. So I did these columns for each one of them, and these columns are about 400 millimeters length by a diameter of approximately 125 millimeters. So what I basically did is, when the test was over, I molded the column and then I took it out, and then after that I manually took measurements along the column going from bottom to top. So as I went along, then I established a coordinate system on my Excel chart where I actually plotted it as a curve, which is what you're seeing in figure A. All the red dots are the marks, the points where I took the measurements, and that was in a way to help me establish what was the maximum bulging. It was an accurate way to establish the maximum bulging. But what is very interesting to note is, because I was plotting it as a curve on Excel and I was doing it as a symmetrical thing of measurement, there's no way I can know exactly how much is the distance, the bulging on the right side of the column or on the left side of the column. If you look at figure B, you will see how the columns, they do not deform symmetrically. There are variations in the form they deform. But if I'm measuring the diameter at any one point, the diameter is the same. That doesn't change. If I plot it symmetrical or not, it's still the same. Therefore, to ease my understanding of it, so for each pictorial representation, I've also had a graphical representation where I could now easily measure what is the maximum bulging and also what is the extent of that bulge and what's the position of the bulge in a more accurate way. So I've also provided two more figures just to show you how exactly this was represented. So in figure A here, where you see dB, so that's the diameter of the maximum bulge, which was 150 millimeters. Remember, initially I said when I installed a column, we're installing a column of 100 millimeter. But the truth of the matter is that when you install these columns, they are not exactly 100 millimeter. And you will see that as you install them, they're already bulging to a certain extent during the compaction, which is why for each one of them, the change, the improvement is only compared on post-testing, not before and after testing. So all the bulging that has been done for the comparison for the first test, second test, third test, fourth test, all of them has been compared with, for example, I'm not sure if I'm being very clear here, if I'm losing anyone, but in figure A, if I look at the first column on the left, this column had absolutely 0%, so it has absolutely no reinforcement in. But in the second one, that's when I have my series of tests where I have my first concentration of the fiber, then the second concentration of the fiber, and then the third concentration of the fiber. Then I'm now able to see how did the diameter of the bulge change as I went along with increasing the amount of the reinforcement concentration. So that's pretty much similar. Just look at, I'm changing from both slides. The first one is randomly mixed fibers. Look at the shape of the columns. And then in the second one, I've now included geotextile. Just look at how different those shapes are, how different the geotextile make it. It reduces those bulging when you're including that. And those are some characteristics of summary which I've provided in terms of the maximum bulging diameter for each test. Was there an increase? Was there a decrease in the diameter and in the bulge diameter? And also, what was the length? In the last column, it's the length of span. Length of span basically means what was the depth that this maximum bulging was extending? It was extended to. So this one, it was the maximum bulge was distributed over a length of 40 millimeter. But if you look at some of the tests, there was a maximum bulge and over a very, very short span, just 10 millimeter. So all of that, it has an effect when you consider failure of the columns, and those information are quite important. Findings from research, there are other findings also which were derived from this research besides the main two that I've discussed today, the load settlement characteristics and the deformation characteristics. There are other things which have been done in the research. As I've said, you are very welcome to have a look at the document and browse through. One of the things that I looked at in terms of environmental sustainability was the quantities of sand which was used in each test and the PET as well. It's a very important information, because if we're talking about environmental sustainability, I talked about the Waste Act earlier and making use of reducing the use of natural resources as well. So sand is a natural resource. So if we can reduce that amount by making use of the PET, which is a waste already that's going to go into landfill, if it's going into landfill and doesn't have any other purpose, then that's a way of reducing the natural resource of sand. The position of bulging and the extent of the bulge. So all of these have been graphically represented, which you can see in the document. There's also a short section on settlement reduction analysis. How did the settlement reduced when compared at a certain level of stress being applied? Empirical equations were also developed for each set of testing. So when I say set of testing, I basically mean when, say for instance, I'm looking at randomly mixed fibers. So I said I had three in a silt of maybe at liquid limit. So I said I had three concentrations, right? So that would be one set of testing condition. And if I look at that, then I will be able to plot a graph, which I've done in the document, you will see, and then you can derive empirical equations from there to represent the relationship between the material and the different other loading characteristics and bulging. Comparison of performances from two types of geotextile, that has also been done. How does the geotextile which was manufactured from waste, how does that compare with the one, the performance, how does it compare with the one which has been manufactured by a virgin PET? The major conclusions: fibers appeared to be a better reinforcement than flakes generally. Randomly mixed fibers were better than layers of fibers. The optimum improvement, I mean the best performing test out of all of them, was actually the one where fibers at a concentration of 0.1% were randomly mixed and in a column which was installed in a silt at liquid limit. And percentage improvement in the load carrying capacity was 244%, which is quite high. At optimum moisture contents, geotextiles were better than the flakes and fibers. Waste PET geotextile, the highest mass per unit area, produced highest reduction in settlement, and that was very close to the one obtained for randomly mixed fibers. In terms of layering, it was better for bulge size reduction, especially for tests on silts done at liquid limit. At optimum moisture content, the smallest bulging diameter of 110 millimeter was recorded, and that corresponded to the test where fibers were used at a concentration of 0.83% in layers. For cells at liquid limit, the smallest bulging diameter was at 124 millimeter, and that was with the geotextile, which was manufactured from PET waste, and also the thickest geotextile with a mass per unit area of 600 gram per meter square. This is an empirical equation, the general form, which has been derived. So you will see if you look at the table in the document regarding the empirical equation, there's a series of equations that has been derived for each test set. And they were either derived to show the relationship between the vertical stress that one will achieve when using a certain amount of reinforcement, or the bulging diameter that will be attained when using a certain amount of reinforcement. Irrespective of which one I looked at, there was a general form of the equation. It was a polynomial of third order that was obtained. The recommendation for further research, large-scale testing, I think, is highly recommended at this stage to really see how the tests operate at a larger scale. The drainage effect was not looked at all in this study because it's a complete independent study on its own. And before knowing which type of reinforcement operates better, it was important to avoid looking at the drainage effect. It would introduce other variables, and it's just a very, very lengthy process. It's very important to first identify which reinforcement is the better material. Now that we've been able to establish that, it's now a stage to take it further to understand the drainage effect when using the different type of reinforcement. Also, to establish the shear strength of the different test specimen prepared. That's also very important to know how the shear strength are different. Research physical and chemical degradation of the flakes and fibers. Now, PET is a very stable material, which is why it's also used to manufacture the geotextiles. Having said that, the way geotextiles are manufactured, the very obvious reason that one will see is it seemed to be much stronger than just looking at the flakes or the fibers, especially independently. So it's very important to understand the physical and the chemical degradation, and some research will need to be done on that. Also, some numerical modeling in future will be very relevant to foresee how different type of conditions will result in different behaviors of the reinforced columns. And also, at the last stage probably would be to investigate the effect of a group of columns, although we've said that the columns can be looked at individually, but there's also some kind of like boundary effects and all of that come into play. So those are interesting topics to look at. If we have some students in the presentation today, just take all of these into consideration. They are really interesting topics to look into. This is the link that I've provided for the dissertation. So the title is there for the study, and it's available from OpenUCT. You can download it, and it's free of charge. For the study, I'm coming now to an end of my presentation, and I would like to acknowledge different people who have formed part of making this research successful and given us such fruitful results. The first person would be Professor Dennis Kalumba from UCT, who has supervised this research. In actual fact, he's the one who's been supervising all the research for the past 9 years in stage 1, 2, and 3. I would also like to thank the Geotechnical Engineering Research Group at UCT for funding the research, the laboratory staffs in the Civil Engineering Department at UCT for assisting in the tests. I would also like to thank Cora Brick for supplying the Durbanville silt, which was used for doing all the tests to replicate a field scenario. Thank you very much to Fibertex South Africa for supplying the fibers and the geotextiles, and to K-Tech Engineer Fabrics for supplying the flakes. I also extend my thanks to the CEO of Petco, Ms. Sherry Scholz, for her guidance, and her colleagues as well for their guidance in PET recycling in South Africa. And Extrapet, the joint MD, Mr. Chandra Wadwani, for granting access and organizing a tour of his recycling plant. I've included some references which I think I might have missed a few here and there, but I'll just see how I'll update it later. But that's pretty much all I have got to share with you all for this evening. And thank you very much for attending and making time out of a busy schedule and listening to what I have to say. I hope the research result is appealing to you. And if you do have any questions, I think this will be a right time. I've also put my email address. If you do feel you've got any further query at a later stage, you can still get in touch with me. But I think I can now open the floor to questions if there are any. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Lakshmi. I think this was a very interesting and a very relevant topic. So from myself, behalf of GeoDiv and all the attendees, thank you very much for your time today and for putting this together for us. I think for all of us up here in Joburg, when tomorrow's cold front comes through, we'll remember how many PET bottles we're going to wear tomorrow when we put on our fleece jackets. So, okay. For all the attendees, the Q&A is open. Please post your questions. Lakshmi, I see a couple of questions have already been posted by Bazi. If you just scroll a little bit up to about the time 4:41, there was a question there. But yeah, please feel free to post your questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And yeah, we'll take it from there.
All right, thank you very much, Brett. Let me have a look at the list of questions. I see there's a question from Bazi here. Dear Lakshmi, thank you for the detailed ground improvement. My understanding is that this ground improvement works well in granular material. Did we assess the performance of this ground improvement in clays? Thank you very much, Bazi, for the question. In actual fact, the test which was done in stage 2 was done on a clay, and that the reason why it was done was to really establish how the test operates in clays, because granular column is mostly popular to be installed in clays, so not really in granular material so much, unless in the certain cases we do use stone columns in fine silts. I hope I answer your question. There's a second question from Bazi. Was the effect of the dilation of the silt taken into account in the final performance? At this stage, no, it was not taken. Dilation was not taken, simply because the aim was to identify what type of reinforcement would be most appropriate. Once this has been identified, I think at present we are very clear on that. The fibers and the geotextile are definitely materials to look into for further research. Further research should definitely consider all of that. Thank you very much. Am I seeing any other question? Let me just check through. Yes, there's another question by Bazi. Was there a projection of the reinforcement performance with age, such as an accelerated testing on the reinforcement? How would the load carrying capacity and settlement change with time? Thanks, Bazi, for this question. I think I answered that already when I mentioned about the recommended research to be undertaken. That's definitely a very valid point to look into. And that's when I talked about checking the physical and chemical degradation of the material. Are there any other questions?
Lakshmi, I don't see any other questions coming through at this point. Maybe okay. Let's just it's another few moments, see if there are any questions, but in the next minute or so, if there's no further questions, then I think we can call it an evening.
Sure. All right.
Okay, while we just wait for any more questions, from our side, the video will be downloaded and it will be uploaded to the GeoDivs event page and the YouTube channel, and that will probably happen, I mean, the download will happen straight away, but to upload, we're probably looking at early next week. So you will be able to view the presentation from next week online. Okay, Lakshmi, I don't see any more questions. Again, a sign of a great presentation when there's not many questions. So well done there.
Thank you very much, Brett. I just hope nobody has fallen asleep, hey?
No, I don't think so.
But thanks very much for organizing SAICE and GeoDiv. It's been very great having this presentation finally. We've been working on the background for a while, and I'm glad to finally be able to share with the different people in the industry. Thanks very much.
Lakshmi, one more question just came in. Okay. Basically, what is the lifespan of PET underground?
That's a very interesting question. It's very broad in the sense that it really depends on different factors. The pH is one of the things that's very important to know. But I've read studies where PET can stay up to 500 years in the ground. A plastic bottle PET can stay up to 500 years in the ground. Having said that, for us engineers, with the aim that we're trying to use this in the ground, it might not necessarily mean that when we put the PET in the ground, it's going to fulfill our function for 500 years, simply because there's degradation and all of that that's happening, as I said earlier, the physical degradation. Chemical degradation, not so much. As I said, it also depends on the type of ground, what's present in there, chemical aspects of it, how it's attacking the material and all of that. But PET is quite a stable material. So, I mean, those who work with geosynthetics will know that. Quite a stable material. Yeah, I hope I answered the question.
Okay, thanks for that, Lakshmi. I think we should call it for today. There's no more questions coming through. So again, thank you very much for giving us your time today. Thank you for putting this together.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so that's it. Thanks to all the attendees for joining. Everyone
have a great day.
Keep safe and goodbye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.